Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. I want to point out that all court testimony in AffairsValentino is cited verbatim from the original testimony as included in the court records. From page 208, chapter 11, paragraph 4th. 7 years later, Los Angeles, February 1931. It was disorder in the court from the moment Attorney Raymond Stewart announced to a packed courtroom that he had located a copy of Rudy's instructions for George. Reporters scribbled on their notepads, spectators buzzed in anticipation, and the judge demanded silence. Throughout the court's long holiday recess, Raymond Stewart and George were unable to shake a sense of dread at the prospect of surrendering the document to the court. Both men knew full well that in doing so they would instigate a disastrous chain of events that would impact everyone involved in the case of Guglielmi v. Ullman. The first casualties would be Alberto Valentino and Lou Mahoney, who sparred from the witness stand to disavow any role in the disappearance of the original copy of the document. Tempers flew, accusations were made, and before the dust settled, one of them would commit perjury. When the judge handed the fragile sheet of onion skin paper to the court clerk for submission as evidence, Alberto's attorney James Scarborough rose to object to the document's authenticity. He alleged Attorney Stewart's carbon copy was an outright forgery and demanded the original typewriter used to execute the document be located and brought into the courtroom for examination. He then petitioned the court to subpoena the stenographer who typed Rudy's September 1925 last will and testament, as well as this alleged sheet of instructions. When the judge determined the stenographer to be deceased, Raymond Stewart, as the lawyer who executed Rudy's will, was summoned to testify. Under oath, he explained how he discovered the carbon copy while reviewing the Valentinos' divorce file in search of a copy of their property settlement. He reminded the judge that he subpoenaed a copy of the Valentinos' property settlement before court adjourned the previous December. During further questioning, Stewart recalled delivering both the existing page of Rudy's will as well as the sheet of instructions to Falcon Lair. He asserted that at that time neither page was signed by any witnesses. Stewart concluded his testimony by saying that until he found the copy in his files, he did not know if Rudy ever signed the page of instructions, thereby rendering it a legal document. He added he did not know if George Ullman ever received a copy of the first page of the will or the sheet of instructions. Teresa Warner's attorney made a rare appearance in the courtroom to petition the court to declare the carbon copy a valid portion of Rudy's will. Throughout the lengthy court proceedings, Teresa Warner never filed a single objection to George's performance as executor, and in reference to the carbon copy of instructions, she stood by him once again. Through their respective attorneys, Teresa Warner and George objected to Alberto's request that the typewriter be subpoenaed by arguing that a search for the typewriter would unnecessarily delay the court's proceedings. The judge agreed and set this issue aside. The line of questioning then returned to whether the original instructions were removed from the first page of the will, and if this were the case, by whom. For one brief moment, everyone in the courtroom was in agreement on one key point. No one disputed Rudy kept his will in Falcon Lair's safe, and that the only three people with access to this safe were Rudy, Alberto, and handyman Lou Mahoney. Lou Mahoney was again subpoenaed to testify and trudged back to the witness stand. Under oath, he acknowledged he signed the sheet of instructions as a witness, but blamed the disappearance of the original copy of that portion of the will upon Mr. Valentino himself. In response to a question as to how Mr. Valentino could tamper with his will in the days following his own death, Lou had an answer. He alleged that on the day before Mr. Valentino left Hollywood for the last time in July of 1926, he summoned him to Falcon Lair's office and opened the safe. It was then, Lou said, that Mr. Valentino removed his will and showed him both pages of the document. Under further questioning, Lou could offer no explanation why his boss shared his will with his handyman at that particular time. Lou went on to recall that it was early the following morning when Mr. Valentino drove to Polanegri's home to say goodbye before leaving on this trip east. According to Lou, a short while later, Mr. Valentino telephoned him requesting he drive to Polanegri's as he needed a ride home. Again, Lou could offer no explanation why Mr. Valentino drove his own vehicle to Polanegri's and then telephoned his handyman for a ride home. Sidestepping certain deep holes in his testimony, Lou continued. In his gravelly voice, he testified that Mr. Valentino returned home that day with ample time to open his office safe and destroy the second page of the will before leaving for New York on the evening train. Lou was also adamant he drove his boss to meet that train. Lou was then asked if he personally witnessed Mr. Valentino removing the sheet of instructions from the will, or if he had any knowledge why Mr. Valentino would destroy a critical portion of his will before leaving on a routine promotional tour. Lou replied no to both questions. With another sidestep, Lou testified that he returned to Falconlaire's office the day after Mr. Valentino left Los Angeles and attempted to open the safe. He told the court he was unable to do so because the lock had been changed. Lou had no recollection of why he needed to open his boss's safe on that particular day, and instead turned an accusatory finger on a more ready target, Alberto Valentino. Lou alleged it was Mr. Alberto Guglielmi Valentino who was the guilty party, and that he changed the safe's combination the very morning Mr. Rudolph Valentino left Los Angeles. Lou had honed his nerve as a cop with one of the toughest precincts in New York City, and despite further intense interrogation, he did not flinch. In his final version of events, Lou swore his boss, Rudolph Valentino, shared the contents of his 2-page will with him shortly before leaving on a trip from which he never returned. According to Lou, Mr. Valentino then proceeded to secretly destroy the second page of his will before his departure from Los Angeles, and the following day, Alberto changed the combination of the office safe. Across the courtroom, Alberto suffered through Lou's convoluted testimony, and when he took the witness stand, he fired back with a contradictory story. He testified his brother Rudolph did not visit Polanegri's home early on the morning of his final day in Hollywood, but instead spent the entire day at home in Falconlaire. He continued by saying it was late afternoon when he and Rudy drove together to Paula's Ambassador Hotel bungalow, where she joined them on the drive to the Southern Pacific train station. There, he told the court, they met George and Bea Ullman, said their goodbyes, and Rudy and George boarded the Southern Pacific's Lark. Alberto then explained how he drove Polanegri home in Rudy's car before returning to Falconlaire. He denied ever opening his brother's safe or ever changing the lock on the safe. He said that at that time he was busy preparing for his and his family's departure for New York, and insisted no one opened the office safe the day Rudy left, the day before, or the day after. With Lou and Alberto swearing to opposite stories, it was anybody's guess who had just committed perjury. George's attorney Leonard Wilson requested the court subpoena Polanegri to clarify the issue. Soon after it was determined she was in Europe, he dropped this request. Before Lou could be recalled to the witness stand to respond to Alberto's contradictory testimony, the judge declared the entire line of questioning a waste of the court's time. He ruled that it appeared impossible to determine precisely what happened to the original sheet of instructions, and to everyone's astonishment, he declared the smudged carbon copy the legitimate second page of Rudolph Valentino's will. The document was labeled Paragraph 4th. For nearly 5 years, Rudolph Valentino's last will and testament existed as a 1-page document in which he specified that the financial assets of his estate be divided between 3 apparent heirs, his 2 siblings and Teresa Warner. On February 7th, 1931, a second page was added to his will. In the revised will, which included Paragraph 4th, Rudy named his sole heir and beneficiary of his trust as Gene Valentino and instructed all assets of his estate be held in trust for him alone until his 25th birthday. The document also designated that not a penny more than specified weekly stipends be distributed from estate funds to Alberto, Maria Strada, or Teresa Warner. Only Gene's premature death would elevate Alberto and Maria to the status of Rudy's lawful heirs. Paragraph 4th also irrefutably granted George Ullman sweeping authority over all of Rudy's postmortem affairs and charged him with the dual role of estate executor and head of Rudolph Valentino Productions. And precisely as George had always claimed to be the case, Rudy specifically called for the continued existence of his production company. Although George was obviously relieved to have tangible evidence of the instructions he claimed Rudy once verbally shared with him, paragraph 4th complicated his legal situation. Since Rudy's death, George, as executor, had acted solely upon the contents of the existing first page of the will, which apparently named Alberto, Maria, and Aunt Teresa as Rudy's rightful heirs. Based upon this single page, George advanced these three people nearly $70,000 of estate funds. According to paragraph 4th, as executor, he dispersed these estate funds without authority, and he could be held personally responsible to reimburse the estate for the entire amount. Except for one perjurious individual, everyone in the courtroom was baffled by the legal interpretation of Rudy's elusive instructions. They also wondered why Lou Mahoney, who signed paragraph 4th as a witness, failed to come forward to verify the paper's validity as a legal document during the 4 years of the contentious settlement of Rudy's estate. Privately, George doubted that Alberto had any involvement in the original document's disappearance. Despite the obvious fact Alberto would have benefited financially from the disappearance of the instructions, George knew that at the time the document vanished, Alberto struggled with even basic conversational English. He also knew that during the few days between Alberto's arrival in Los Angeles and the filing of the single-page will on September 10th, Alberto had no legal representation. George not only thought it unlikely that Alberto could comprehend the legal terminology of paragraph 4th, but also knew Alberto's testimony regarding Rudy's last 48 hours in Los Angeles to be the absolute truth. George could not as easily eliminate Lou from the list of the two people who had access to Falcon Lair's safe in the days following Rudy's death. For George, the fact Lou signed the document and said nothing about its existence to him, the court, or Alberto strained the credulity of Lou's testimony. George also knew that as a veteran cop, Lou had substantial experience with the judicial system and had served subpoenas, issued arrest warrants, taken the witness stand on multiple occasions, and could easily have understood the terms of paragraph 4th. George wondered if Lou removed the second page of the will in an effort to eliminate his role as head of Rudolph Valentino Productions. If this were the case, George was not surprised. Throughout his tenure as Rudy's manager, it was his job to supervise Falcon Lair's household staff, including the resentful handyman Lou Mahoney. George could not help but remember that just prior to leaving on that fateful trip east with Rudy, he told Lou to look for another job. George also theorized Lou might have engaged in a little evidence tampering after reading the clause in paragraph 4th stating Alberto would receive a stipend of only $100 a week. On that meager allowance, barely twice Lou's salary as handyman, Alberto's ability to maintain Falcon Lair would have quickly become a financial impossibility. In that eventuality, Lou, as handyman of the prestigious residence, would have been out of a job. Despite George's troubling speculations, he was not the only victim of paragraph 4th's discovery, as the unexpected turn of events dealt a stunning blow to Alberto. News that his brother left him no more than a stipend of $100 a week was a humiliating loss of face. He was also shocked to learn that Rudy had indeed appointed George head of Rudolph Valentino Productions, in addition to naming him executor of the estate. Alberto had been waging a public battle against George Ullman for years, claiming the exact opposite was true. Nevertheless, he refused to surrender to the ignoble situation and continued to assert that paragraph 4th was a fraudulent document. When Alberto was summoned to the witness stand, he could offer little driving theory as to why anyone would have forged it in the first place. He was questioned by George's attorney, Leonard Wilson, and asked to explain why he continued to accept George's weekly stipend if he believed his brother's instructions to do so never existed. Leonard Wilson leaned against the railing of the witness stand and asked Alberto, "Did you believe paragraph 4th had been destroyed?" Alberto hesitated for a moment before answering in his heavy accent, "No, I believed that it never existed." "It never existed?" "Yes, sir." "You were taking $100 a week from Mr. Ullman, though, during that time, weren't you?" Alberto's attorney jumped up in protest. "That is objected to as incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial." Leonard Wilson looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, if he did not take it under this instrument, then I want to know where he thought he was getting it from, and by what authority he took it." The judge dispensed his best look of judicial irritation and gave Wilson the nod to proceed. The attorney cleared his throat and returned to his line of questioning. "Go ahead. Do you understand that question?" "No." "Can you read it?" Leonard Wilson requested that the question be read once again for Alberto's benefit. The court stenographer took a moment to flip through the rolls of paper on her small desk before reading in a flat monotone. "You were taking $100 a week from Mr. Ullman, though, during that time, weren't you?" Alberto let out a heavy sigh and asked, "What time, please? It is not determined the time." Wilson was growing impatient and began pacing before his witness. "Well, during 1929. "Yes," Alberto nodded. "Where did you think that stipend was coming from?" "From my share." "For what period of time did you receive this $100 a week?" "In March 1930. "You mean to state now that you don't know by what authority Mr. Ullman gave you that $100 a week?" "Excuse me." Alberto flashed a bewildered look towards his attorney. "Explain to me what means authority. I don't understand." Wilson paused to repeat the question. "Don't you know what authority means?" "No. Will you change the question?" "I want to know what right Mr. Ullman had to give you $100 a week." "What means what right? Don't you understand what the word right means?" "I don't understand the question." Alberto shifted nervously in his seat. "Will you please explain it to me? It is not clear to me." "Why was Mr. Ullman giving you $100 a week, if you know?" "If I know what?" Now visibly exasperated, Attorney Wilson folded his arms over his chest and turned to face his witness. "Do you know why Mr. Ullman was giving you $100 a week?" "He was giving me on my share. I told you before." "My share from what?" "From the estate." "Did you ever ask him for this money, this $100 a week?" "No. Yes, I did ask him for $100 a week." "Did you name the amount?" "No, I name not the amount." "What did you ask for?" "I asked him to give me a certain amount." "Well, what did you ask him for? How much?" "How much he could give me." "Well, did you go in and say, 'I want a certain sum'?" "It was my attorney had arranged that." "How is that?" "It was my attorney had arranged that. I did not ask him myself." "Who was your attorney then?" "Well, at the time it was Mr. Mann." "Sir?" "Mr. William Mann." "He has always been representing you in this matter?" "At that time, yes." "Did you ever register any complaint against George Ullman for giving you the $100 a week?" "No, I did not." "You took that, didn't you?" "Yes, I did." "That was satisfactory with you, wasn't it?" "What means satisfactory?" Attorney Leonard Wilson delivered a passionate closing statement, in which he argued that paragraph 4th authorized George to continue in his role as head of Rudolph Valentino Productions after Rudy's death. He clarified that during George's tenure as executor, he acted upon the terms of the only document he had access to at the time, when he issued cash advances to Alberto Valentino, Maria Strada, and Therese Warner. Wilson explained to the court precisely how George had accommodated the supposed heirs' solicitations for those advances, and argued it would be ludicrous, in light of the unexpected appearance of paragraph 4th, to hold him personally responsible to refund the money to the very people who spent every dime of it. Wilson pleaded with the court to allow George to retain the total amount of the salary he drew as executor, and then detailed once more the finer points of the loans he made to Frank Manillo and the Pan American Bank. The attorney held up the thick ledger of the court-ordered audit's findings as evidence that expert accountant Harry Baskerville had not found a single error in George's books. In closing, the attorney stated that George Allman was Rudolph Valentino's honest and loyal friend, who performed remarkably under difficult and highly unusual circumstances. As evidence of this fact, Wilson pointed to the value of the Valentino estate, which had plummeted from $300,000 to $130,000 in the 8 short months since George's removal as executor. With this, the judge called an end to the proceedings. It would be 1 year later, on August 18, 1932, when a final verdict was rendered. The judge threw the book at George, and he took it straight between the eyes. Although paragraph 4th was declared a valid portion of Rudy's will, the document had no influence upon the judge's decision. He issued his ruling by stating George was never granted the authority to run Rudolph Valentino Productions, and in his role as executor, he should have obtained the court's permission for every business transaction. The judge ordered George to personally reimburse the estate for all the money he loaned Frank Manillo, both the $40,000 for the tomato juice cannery in Merced and another $9,100 advanced as cash. He also ordered George to reimburse the estate for the total amount of the outstanding debt still owed the estate by the defunct Pan American Bank, and every cent he advanced to the Cosmic Arts Laboratory. The judge permitted George to retain $15,000 as salary for his 4-year tenure as executor, but held him responsible to reimburse the estate the nearly $70,000 he advanced to the 3 people he presumed at the time to be Rudy's heirs. The entire judgment levied against George in August of 1932 was calculated at 7% interest retroactive to the date of the transactions. The total ran up at a mind-boggling $183,754. By today's monetary exchange, this would be a judgment of nearly $2 million. Utterly devastated by the court's decision, George granted not a single interview, accepted no telephone calls from the press, and flipped an off switch in his mind where the affairs of Rudolph Valentino were concerned. He was simply done in. Facing the specter of such a crippling judgment, George filed his immediate appeal of the court's decision and focused upon the success of his S. George Allman agency. He tried to ignore the disturbing reports that his replacement as executor of Rudy's estate, A.P. Giannini, and his Bank of America were conducting closeout clearance sales of Rudy's belongings. Particularly painful for George was notice of Giannini's sale of the last of Rudy's antique armor, previously appraised at $20,000. The Bank of America sold the entire lot for less than $1,000. Powerless to do a thing about it, George sat by while all of his financial successes as the executor of Rudy's estate faded away. He was profoundly wounded by the dire turn of events, both emotionally and financially. With funds evaporating, he was forced to move his family once again, this time into another rented home on Cannon Drive. He could scarcely contemplate the repercussions to his household if the appeals court did not reverse the judgment. His wife Bea continued to be in fragile health as she battled a persistent case of tuberculosis, and this only compounded George's overly anxious state. By 1932, Bea spent a good deal of her time bedridden while she recovered from several subsequent surgeries. Her husband was sick with worry. The Ullman children were too young at the time to have the slightest inkling that an appeals court judgment loomed over their home like a swinging wrecking ball. But even at their tender ages, all three children were aware their father faced some stressful situation. On Sunday afternoons, when Dad retreated to his den with his violin under his arm and a tall green glass of bourbon in hand, Dan, Bobby, and Bunny Ullman all knew he was to be left strictly alone. During the 1930s, San Francisco's Montgomery Street was a bustling commercial hub. On any given hour during the work week, the thoroughfare was congested with traffic and pedestrians rushing to and from the street's many brokerage houses. Although attention was usually focused on the afternoon's next appointment, a few Montgomery Street passers-by may have glanced up late one afternoon to gasp at the sight of a portly businessman about to be shoved out of a high-rise office window. From the crowd's vantage point on the street below, it would have been impossible to recognize the poor fellow struggling to keep from toppling to his death as the president of the Bank of America. But inside that high-rise window, Frank Manillo was tightening his grip around the leathery neck of banker A.P. Giannini and roaring at full volume, "Bastardo, bastardo." If George Ullman was retreating to his den to cope with the deteriorating situation, Frank Manillo was taking a more hands-on approach. A.P. Giannini landed in his death-defying predicament after Frank and his son Arnold met with one of Giannini's disgruntled employees, George Underhill. Frank spent the afternoon convincing Underhill to jump Giannini's ship and join his organization. As Frank, Arnold, and George Underhill walked the office building's corridor, they made a quick and fateful stop into a men's room. No sooner had the three men entered the restroom than the door swung open again and A.P. Giannini made the fat mistake of swaggering in. The moment Giannini spotted Frank Manillo, he sensed the imminent threat and whirled around to make his exit. With his hand on the doorknob, he paused to snap back at his mutinous employee, George Underhill. "Don't you think you should be keeping better company, Underhill?" Before Arnold Manillo could make a move to prevent the inevitable, Frank lunged at the suited tycoon. Calling him every foul name he could spit in his direction, Frank grabbed Giannini by the neck, dragged him across the tiled men's room floor, and hefted him up and over the sill of an open window. Arnold was finally able to break his father's grip just long enough to allow Giannini to dash out of the men's room, rubbing his half-broken neck. It was no secret Frank Manillo hated A.P. Giannini. The rift between the two men had grown so fierce that no member of the Manillo family ever stepped foot inside of any Giannini's banks. By 1932, Frank had survived some lean years in California's Central Valley, but he had somehow managed to keep his California Tomato Juice Incorporated solvent. However, Frank blamed Giannini's continuing vendetta against him for most of his business's difficulties. Frank terminated his affiliation with the Valentino family upon receipt of George's $40,000 loan and then headed north to the San Joaquin Valley to work diligently in his new plant on K Street. But times were tough, and as was the case with almost everyone else in the country during the Great Depression, Frank was usually short on cash. He was often unable to afford dinners at his residence, the Merced Hotel, and fed himself and his son Arnold by buying a loaf of bread and some olive oil and visiting his tomato growers to taste the crop. Frank Manillo was not alone in his dire straits. During the first few years after Rudy's death, the cataclysmic downturn of the nation's economy had its unhappy effect upon all of the once powerful players in his life. With the exception of the attorneys, no one in this disbanding brotherhood benefited financially from Alberto's prolonged lawsuit against George. While Frank was struggling in Merced, and George awaiting a decision from the California Court of Appeals, Alberto continued to petition the court for more cash advances from the dwindling estate funds. He was curtly denied on every occasion, and consequently, at the height of the Depression, he was destitute. Any loyalty A.P. Giannini and Joe Schenck might have held for Rudy's only brother had long since waned. As Giannini's Bank of America eliminated the remnants of Rudy's estate, they did much the same with Alberto. The days of George's generous cash advances were long over, and Giannini was unwilling to advance brother Alberto another penny. He did, however, toss him the job of caretaker of Falcon Lair for the unremarkable remuneration of $35 a month, about $145 less than Lou Mahoney was paid to do the same job many years before. Alberto's benefactor of yesteryear, Joe Schenck, could no longer be bothered with the continuing legal travails of Rudy's estate, as he was facing his own Great Depression challenges. In 1933, he and the former head of production at Warner Brothers Studio, Darrell F. Zanuck, founded 20th Century Productions, with a loan of $3 million from pal A.P. Giannini. Schenck and Zanuck then merged their production company with the floundering Fox Films to form 20th Century Fox Films. As chairman of 20th Century Fox, Joe Schenck still held his powerful seat on A.P. Giannini's Bank of America board of directors. It was about this same time that Schenck began cozying up to an even more powerful Hollywood ally than Giannini, Willie Bioff. Willie Bioff was a Chicago racketeer and kingpin in the mob shakedown of Hollywood during the 30s. Not long after his arrival in Hollywood, he commanded Joe Schenck's full attention. As Schenck began engaging in some shady dealings with the organized crime boss, he had no idea federal agents were hot on his movie mogul trail. While Americans were despairing over the lack of jobs, money, and opportunity during the 1930s, such scarcity and privation had no effect upon Rudolph Valentino's popularity. Unlike his estate's disappearing bank account, his popularity thrived. Even though his films had been gathering dust for years, he still commanded an impressive posthumous fan base. Many of the memorial fan clubs George founded in the days immediately following Rudy's death still flourished, and every year faithful fans flocked to his crypt in Hollywood to celebrate the precise moment of his tragic demise. The years of controversy surrounding the settlement of his estate kept Rudy's name in the headlines, and few silent movie stars, especially those deceased, received such consistent press. Rudy's open acknowledgement he participated in occult activities and practiced automatic writing only added to his post-mortem popularity. His dabbling in the other side inspired mystic leanings in many of his followers, who adamantly believed he established his presence among the heavenly hosts long before he ever joined them. Consequently, many psychics during the 1930s advertised their own private lines of communication with Valentino on high. They chanted his name, intoned his Holy Spirit, and a few even clacked out divine transmissions on their typewriters. From the most serious students of the arcane to ridiculous charlatans, they all attempted in one way or another to bridge the ethers and reach the soul of Rudolph Valentino. In 1938, psychic Carol McKinstry claimed she typed a screenplay with Rudy's ethereal assistance, which she titled A Warning from Out the Ages, a psychic consignment from Rudolph Valentino. In Pasadena, Miss Marchen Jorgensen alleged she was able to drop into a trance, sit at her typewriter, and transcribe psychic grocery lists as dictated by the great lover. She said she passed Rudy's laundry lists off to an accomplice who signed for the goods on credit. When it was discovered that Miss Jorgensen's partner was forging a relative's signature on the sales slips for said purchases, both he and Miss Jorgensen were arrested. The continuing intrigues of Rudy's devotees kept his memory alive, despite the disturbing appearance of what was fast becoming a legacy of far-fetched, inaccurate versions of his life story. So many disparate accounts of the great lover's activities were presented for the public's enjoyment that in the resultant hullabaloo, Rudy's legendary talents for lovemaking reached mythical proportions. Unfortunately, this also left him ripe for a smut peddler's picking. Cheap opportunists sidled onto the scene to make their livings by satisfying the public's craving for a juicy read about the chic. Most notorious of these shysters during the 1930s was Samuel Roth. In 1931, he ghostwrote and published most of his raunchy pulp classics under the imprint of Dollar Books, which included such titles as Padlocks and Girdles of Chastity and Sacred Prostitution and Marriage by Capture. That same year, Samuel Roth also churned out The Intimate Journal of Rudolph Valentino. Roth swore on a stack of Bibles that this book was indeed Rudolph Valentino's authentic personal diary, and many of his readers believed this to be the case. It was not. A few years after publishing Rudy's fictional dirty little diary, Samuel Roth was convicted on several charges relating to his underhanded publishing tactics and sentenced to a lengthy stay in a federal penitentiary. Nevertheless, while Roth sat in his prison cell, his readership was held captive by Rudy's torrid, albeit fictional, revelations. Another writer, a reporter from the Chicago Daily News, Hiram Kelly Motherwell, also contributed to this increasingly sordid spin on Rudy's life story. Motherwell gained some measure of notoriety after he published what he claimed were interviews conducted after Rudy's death in the town of his birth, Castellaneta. At the time of his alleged interviews, Hiram Motherwell was closely affiliated with two organizations known for voicing strong disapproval of Rudolph Valentino, his films, and his influence: the Catholic Church and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's Fascista Party. While Hiram Motherwell was allegedly traveling to Castellaneta to conduct his interviews, he was also working as a reporter at the Vatican and writing in ardent support of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Nevertheless, Motherwell reported that he'd traipsed off to southern Italy in the days following the movie star's death and returned with a wealth of disparaging and lewd accounts from his childhood. He alleged that as a child, Rudy was molested by a pedophile nanny, that he exposed himself in front of the congregation of his local church, and that he had been repeatedly beaten by an abusive father. None of Hiram Motherwell's claims were ever substantiated. Not all readers of the continuing saga of the beloved Rudolph stooped to thumb through this self-indulgent porn of Samuel Roth and Hiram Motherwell. A few respectable publications, such as the Literary Digest, reported upon the continuing activities of the many Valentino memorial guilds. In London, the Daily Express reviewed a showing of Rudy's film Monsieur Beaucaire, as hosted by the London Valentino Memorial Guild, and commented upon the arrival of one ardent fan's homage to Rudy. The woman arrived at the theater toting an old shirt, which she tearfully explained Rudolph Valentino had once worn. She carried her precious item in a custom-made, gold-embroidered miniature casket. By the spring of 1934, one contributor to Rudolph Valentino's legacy, Mrs. Zunilda Mancini, had withdrawn her support of the Valentino Memorial she funded by filing her own lawsuit against George Ullman. She alleged the Burnham statue titled Aspirations cost considerably less than the total of her checks, $6,900, and she demanded a full refund. When George was unable to document his claim that the statue in fact cost considerably more, the court ruled in Mancini's favor, and he was ordered to repay the New York widow $5,400. George hired another attorney, Arthur C. Fisher, to handle this case, and appeared in court to explain his dire straits. He stated that although his talent agency had 20 clients at the time, few of them were currently working. He then filed an appeal of the new judgment against him with the California Court of Appeals. When the Los Angeles Times reported the news of the court's ruling in Mancini's favor, Alberto Valentino took exception with the article and wrote the newspaper a scathing letter to the editor. He interpreted the paper's reference to Mrs. Mancini's remark about, quote, all Italians being good men, to imply that the Burnham statue had been commissioned by an Italian. In his letter, he erroneously stated that George Ullman commissioned a statue, was not an Italian, and had been forced to resign as executor. Alberto went on to accuse the Los Angeles Times of issuing a, quote, severe and unwarranted insult to all Italians. The Times responded by issuing a no reflection intended response, but added further injury to Alberto's perceived insult when they referred to him as Gilbert. For all of the furtive perusing of news about Rudolph Valentino, whether reverent or lewd, fact or fiction, few of his fans probably caught a tiny 15-line item which appeared in a few local papers in Los Angeles on April 18, 1934. Quote, "The District Court of Appeals yesterday exonerated S. George Ullman of charges of mismanagement of the estate of Rudolph Valentino, of which he was executor, when it reversed an order of the Los Angeles Probate Court. Ullman's management had been objected to by Gene Guglielmi, nephew and heir to the estate, who charged that Ullman had made too many cash advances to the other heirs. The appellate court praised Ullman for his work." End quote. With no further elaboration upon the appeals court's decision, any readers who did spot the insignificant article could scarcely have understood the ramifications of the reversal of the judgment. George had been waiting a long time to read news of his unconditional exoneration, and the appeals court not only praised his hard work for Rudy's estate, they defended it from criticism. The appeals court chastised the lower court judge who levied the original judgment against George and agreed that it could not be determined who was responsible for the disappearance of the second page of Rudy's will, paragraph 4th. The Court of Appeals also reported they found no evidence George ever had any knowledge of the terms of paragraph 4th prior to dispersing cash advances to the three people he honestly believed to be Rudy's legitimate heirs. The appeals court's decision criticized Alberto Valentino for having brought his lawsuit against George in the first place, and stated that after reviewing the court-ordered audit of George's books and after conducting their own investigation, they found, quote, not the slightest scintilla of evidence that George Ullman ever acted in bad faith. The appeals court decision dismissed George's liability for the $40,000 loan made to Frank Manillo, and dismissed his liability for the Cosmic Arts operational costs, as well as any losses incurred from his loan to the Pan American Bank. The appeals court held that these transactions were made in the course of running the legitimate business, Rudolph Valentino Productions. However, this was the entire extent of any good news for George from the appeals court. The appeals ruling went on to elaborate that as a result of the discovery of paragraph 4th, Alberto Valentino, Maria Estrada, and Teresa Warner were never entitled to any cash advances other than their weekly stipends. Consequently, the court held George legally responsible to reimburse the estate for the total of all cash advances made to those three individuals, nearly $70,000. The revised judgment handed down by the Court of Appeals in August of 1934 declared George innocent on Alberto's charges of fraud and mismanagement, but still held him accountable for the $70,000 of cash advances plus a portion of his executor's salary not allowed by the court. This entire amount was calculated at 7% interest and totaled nearly $100,000. The welcome news of his exoneration was still a severe financial blow for George, but he held on to one lingering hope. Alberto and Gene Valentino might dismiss the entire judgment based upon a key recommendation issued by the Court of Appeals. The appeals decision advised that in light of the unusual disappearance and discovery of paragraph 4th, Alberto and Gene Valentino should waive George's liability for the reimbursement of the cash advances and establish instead an appropriate fairness lien against the beneficial interest of those who actually participated in the advancement of the property and funds. In December of 1934, 4 months after the appeals court decision was handed down, All parties involved met once again in a Los Angeles courtroom to sign their signatures and hopefully declare an end to the disputed settlement of Rudy's estate. On this occasion, the court addressed the legal quandary of George's liability for the cash advances made to the ersatz heirs, and addressed the possible establishment of a lien to recuperate the funds for the estate. Instead of ruling on this troublesome issue, the judge passed the buck by dismissing the entire subject until such time that the final decree of the distribution of the estate was issued and Jean Valentino inherited the estate. This stopgap measure postponed the final decision on the subject of George's liability for the cash advances, thereby deducting $70,000 from the judgment and temporarily reducing his total due the Valentino estate to $25,849. George held his breath, took the reprieve, and delayed worrying about those aggravating cash advances until the final decree of distribution took place when Jean turned 25. But the reduction of the judgment to $25,000 was still an empty victory for George. With the average American family's income in 1934 somewhere between $1,300 and $1,600 a year, clearing a debt 20 times this amount from George's modest earnings would be nearly impossible. For Alberto Valentino, the appeals court decision meant he could finally initiate official collection processes on George. This came at an auspicious time for Alberto, as his financial situation was by then so grave that he sat down with gossip columnist Luella Parsons to bewail his rotten luck story. He told her he had less than $17 in his pocket at that very moment and implored her to inform her readers that he was in search of a job. Alberto explained his plight by saying he was downright penniless after years of litigation settling his brother's estate. He neglected to add that this litigation was entirely his doing. During this interview, Alberto demonstrated little understanding of the recent appeals court decision, when he informed Ms. Parsons that George Ullman owed him $25,000 as his share of his brother's estate. He also acknowledged that while his lawsuit against Ullman had been pending, the Bank of America hired him as caretaker of his brother's Falcon Lair. He continued his interview by telling Luella Parsons that when the bank recently sold the property, he had been given 15 days' notice to vacate the premises. Luella pounced upon the shocking news that Rudolph Valentino's brother was about to be tossed to the curb. She appealed to the public to run, not walk, to Alberto's assistance. Apparently her plea was heard, as the Bank of America permitted him to move into Rudy's Whitley Heights home, and he secured several uncredited roles in a few B-movies, including Fatal Lady, One Rainy Afternoon, and China's Slave. Luella Parsons would soon have more to write about, as bad luck continued to stalk Rudy's older brother. While he was moving into the Whitley Heights home, burglars broke through a back window and robbed the place blind. Meanwhile, George was acutely aware that his every asset, no matter how trivial, had become vulnerable to Alberto and Jean Valentino's seizure. With this in mind, he transferred legal ownership of his personal property to his S. George Ullman Agency, Incorporated. While he endeavored to safeguard his home and business, the 7% interest on the judgment continued to accrue. By this time, the name George Ullman had ceased to make headlines, and consequently the public knew next to nothing about the finer points of his complex and unhappy situation. The half-hearted 1.5-column-inch report of his vindication by the appeals court sounded to the few who read it as if the subject of Valentino's estate was finally a closed book. Indeed, George, Alberto, and Jean Valentino were the only players left in the melodrama. Even lingering interest in Valentino's old guard had dried up. They were all, one by one, taking their leave. By 1936, Frank Manillo had closed his tomato juice plant in Merced and moved south to Los Angeles to work in produce brokerage. It was doubtful A.P. Giannini was unhappy to learn Frank Manillo had finally gone out of business. It was not long after Frank's return to Los Angeles from the San Joaquin Valley that Giannini parted ways with one of his long-standing Hollywood compadres, Joe Schenck. The severing of their relationship took place during a Bank of America Board of Directors meeting, in which Giannini expounded upon one Los Angeles Jewish banker's, quote, damnable conspiracy to take control of his bank. With the Jewish Joe Schenck seated beside him at the board table, Giannini had bellowed, "That goddamn Jew is in for a fight to the finish." Schenck was so deeply offended by the remark, he stormed out of the meeting, and 2 days later he submitted his resignation from Giannini's board of directors. Schenck had no time for anti-Semitic remarks, as he was facing a much greater threat to his Hollywood position. He was about to be indicted by the federal government for his underworld dealings. Consequently, by the time the final decree of distribution of Rudolph Valentino's estate was handed down, the cast of characters had narrowed considerably. On that occasion, there were no lengthy front-page articles covering the court's proceedings, no reporters crowding into the courtroom, no mention of any movie executives, and barely any mention of the name Rudolph Valentino. On what would be the final decree in probate case number 83678, only George and Jean Valentino appeared before the honorable judge. And if George Ullman left the courtroom in December of 1934, staggering under the weight of the court's reduced judgment of $25,000, he nearly collapsed under the impact of the court's final decree of distribution in 1937. At the time of this final decree of distribution, Jean Valentino informed the court he intended to ignore the appeals court recommendation to dismiss George's liability for the cash advances. He said he found no cause to establish any such fairness lien to recuperate the money from the very people who benefited from the funds. The last notice the public ever read was that George Ullman owed Rudolph Valentino's estate $25,000. In fact, at the time of the final decree of distribution, the judge complied with Jean's decision and added the total of all cash advances George made before the discovery of paragraph 4th back on to the $25,000 judgment. The precise amount was itemized as Alberto Valentino, $37,411. Maria Strada, $12,516.33. Teresa Warner, $7,617. And the cash amount loaned to Frank Manillo on behalf of Maria's alleged future share of Rudy's estate, $9,100. The total of these advances, $66,644.33, did not include years of accrued interest. 11 years after Rudy's death, George was ordered to surrender a revised total of $92,493.53. The cover of Life magazine's June 20th, 1938 issue carried a full-page profile of Rudolph Valentino and a headline reading, "The Man That Came Back." For 10 cents, Life's subscribers read how 300 old-fangled silent films were being dusted off that year to be shown in theaters across the country. The article reported that the most popular of all these films was Rudolph Valentino's The Son of the Sheik. In Chicago, The Son of the Sheik's box office revenues were even exceeding the year's favorite new features, Test Pilot and Robin Hood. And in New York, the movie played to packed theaters on Broadway and grossed $10,000 and $11,000 a week. Critics were mystified as to why the public held any remote interest in these cinematic relics, and could only attribute the phenomena to the inferior quality of new films being cranked out by Hollywood studios during the Depression. Whatever the reason, in 1938, Rudolph Valentino was thrilling a new audience of starry-eyed fans. Women were once again gasping and swooning as the Son of the Sheik forced himself on the beautiful dancing girl Jasmine, and as he rode his Arabian stallion across the desert sand dunes at blistering speed. In 1938, there was not a dry eye in the movie house, as everyone knew this was Rudolph Valentino's last screen kiss and his final heroic ride into the sunset. In addition to the public's enthusiastic reception, Son of the Sheik's 1938 revival generated sorely needed income for his estate, namely Gene Valentino, as he was poised to at last receive his inheritance. As this auspicious day approached, the cash value of his inheritance was vanishing as surely as his attorney's bank accounts were thriving, with some sources reporting that the estate was actually insolvent. Revenue from the Son of the Sheik's revival was welcome coin in the coffers. On August 14, 1939, Gene celebrated his 25th birthday and legally inherited Rudy's estate. But during Gene's 25 years of life, he'd also inherited one other legacy, Alberto's trenchant anger towards George Ullman. While Alberto had been tenaciously demanding his piece of Rudy's estate and George Ullman, young Gene paid close attention. By 1939, he wore this Ullman angst like a family crest. He ascended into his new role as benefactor of Rudy's estate by declaring a new order. Any further public mention of such embarrassing issues as weekly stipends, collection processes against George Ullman, and the very existence of that second page of Rudy's will, paragraph 4th, were henceforth silenced. With Gene in command of the Valentino estate, all reports to the public about such unpleasantries, other than the pointed reminder that George Ullman owed the estate an enormous amount of money, summarily ceased. As far as Gene was concerned, the public need never know that he paid his attorneys a small fortune to enforce a court order which demanded that George reimburse $66,644.33 to the very people, including Alberto, who spent that money many years before. Publicly, George remained silent on the issue of the judgment. He tried to move on with his life and never commented upon the increase in the final judgment from $25,000 to nearly $100,000. He just hoped to negotiate a reasonable settlement with the young blood Gene and settle the impossible debt. Whether Gene was about to ease Alberto's hard line or not, only time would tell. Gene and Alberto Valentino were not alone as they downplayed the seamier aspects of the settlement of Rudy's estate. Lou Mahoney was also keeping mum. He said nothing about his involvement in the disappearance of paragraph 4th, nor did he ever extend his apologies regarding his refusal to come forward to acknowledge the critical document's existence. Nevertheless, Lou received considerable national press coverage in 1930, as he narrowly dodged incriminating evidence on the witness stand. After his high-profile appearance in the courtroom, Lou's role in Rudolph Valentino's story seemed to grow more influential with each telling. As Valentino's handyman, he did have many genuine anecdotes upon which to construct his history of events. After all, he fed the falcons, dug the movie star's ditches, fetched his broken-down cars, repaired his masonry, ran errands, built aviaries, and checked the oil and changed the tires on his vehicles. Although Mr. Valentino, as Lou referred to him, retained many other loyal staff members on Falcon Lair's payroll, including Lou's own brother, only Lou had been subpoenaed into court, where he received national press coverage for his role in Valentino's life. Surpassing the ordinary accomplishments of his fellow members of the Falcon Lair staff, it seemed fate tapped only Lou the handyman to become part of the story. Basking in this limelight, Lou embellished and glamorized his role in the events long after they transpired, by issuing reports of his substantial authority in his boss's life. In Lou's post-Valentino world, his position as hired hand was transformed into that of power broker and grandfatherly confessor, despite the fact he was only 2 years older than Rudy at the time of his employment. While Lou recounted his sentimental yarn of life at Falcon Lair, he had difficulty accurately recollecting several key appearances with Mr. Valentino at various train stations. This rendered many of these scenarios chronologically impossible. He claimed he met Mr. and Mrs. Valentino in New York during the summer of 1924. and drove them to the train station when they left New York City for Hollywood in November. Lou added that it was upon Rudy's personal invitation that he packed up and moved his family to Los Angeles within the following year. In fact, by November 24, as Rudy and Natasha boarded that train in New York, Lou was already 3,000 miles away and had been living in Los Angeles with his family for 7 months. Lou's memory continued to drift, as he alleged that neither Mr. Valentino nor Mrs. Valentino ever had the slightest inclination towards spiritualism of any nature, nor had they ever participated in seances or automatic writing. And although Lou owned and operated Rudy's dry cleaning business for years, he emphatically stated he never had a thing to do with that business or any dry cleaning business. He further alleged he was never employed by Rudolph Valentino as his handyman, but as his, quote, personal affairs manager, and that he was, quote, in charge of his house and the domestic help and everything that belonged to him, end quote. George said nothing to dispute Lou's many false impressions. Consequently, the handyman's hazy recollections contributed to Alberto and Jean Valentino's new order of meticulous censorship, and the truth about all of their involvements in Rudolph Valentino's life began to veer hopelessly towards outright fiction. It would not be too far in the distant future that this turn of events would rewrite both Rudolph Valentino's and George Ullman's life stories. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 12, titled Hoping to be Kindly Remembered. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find your copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and all online book selling venues.